when it comes to national politics, immigration, and the question of what rights to grant undocumented immigrants are flashpoints that yield plenty of conflict, but not much in terms of solutions. Lately, here in Massachusetts, however, the picture has been different. Last year, voters passed a ballot question that will let men and women without legal status get driver's licenses if they can provide proof of identity and residence and complete the requisite testing. And now a push to let immigrants without permanent legal status pay in-state tuition at public colleges and universities seems to be gaining some momentum on Beacon Hill, with support from the state Senate, Governor Reilly, and some big stakeholders in the world of higher ed. So what exactly is the rationale for that change? What are the arguments against it? And how likely is it to become law when negotiations between the Senate, the governor, and the Massachusetts House have run their course? Joining me to discuss are State Senator Liz Miranda, who's filed separate legislation to make in-state tuition for undocumented students a reality, and reporter Jennifer Smith of CommonWealth magazine. She's been covering the push as it moves forward. Good to see you both. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Senator, your plan, if I understand it correctly, is similar to the plan that's contained in the Senate budget. What are the details people should know about?
So the folks should know, first, we want to thank Senate President Spilka and Chairman of Ways and Means, Michael Rodriguez. My predecessor, Sonia Chang Diaz, worked on this a lot. Mira has been pushing this bill, and that's why we filed it. And Senator Crichton has been working with me on this similar bill. 1 in 6 people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are foreign-born. We have over 14,000 young people between the ages of 3 and 17 that will be graduating from our mostly public school system who are undocumented. There are already 12,000 students in our community college and college system that are already undocumented. This is about in-state tuition. It is very expensive to go to college. And we know that DACA students, TPS students already have access to be able to get in-state tuition, which is nearly half of what it costs for someone out of state. For an example, 23 states and the District of Columbia have already passed legislation like this, and we're falling behind. This is not only a moral imperative, but I think practical for equity and inclusion and for student success.
All right, you anticipated my next question, which was going to be what's the rationale for this? So talk me through the details. To get in-state tuition, right, if this plan becomes a reality, what would you need to do? Because if I understand correctly, there's requirements about how much time you spent in a Massachusetts high school. So what are they?
So the first requirement is have you spent 3 years or more in a Massachusetts public school? The second, can you show a valid Social Security number or a taxpayer ID? The third and fourth are pretty similar. Can you show an affidavit that you're actually going through the process of getting your immigrant status closer to what we need in terms of being a lawful citizen or permanent resident of the Commonwealth, or have you signed up for service? I can give you an example of a student, I'll call him William. He worked on my campaign. He was a great young man, stellar student at the community college system, and he was about to go into a state institution. And when he was going to apply, they could not offer him in-state tuition. But he had already gone through the immigration steps. But because of COVID-19, there are 2-3-year backlogs on getting his renewed green card, and that actually stopped him from being able to afford UMass Boston. And so now he's in Utah at Brigham Young. But if we could keep that young man here with the in-state tuition, this is why we're pushing so hard for this.
Thanks for that example. Just to be clear, he was not a DACA recipient, right? You said
no,
DACA recipients already get in-state tuition? Okay. Jen Smith, I actually learned that this was a burgeoning issue from reading your piece in CommonWealth, which I think came out maybe like a week and a half before the Senate released their budget. So great job getting ahead of the news cycle. You reported on a panel that was talking about this issue at the Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate. Were the arguments being made there the same as the ones that Senator Miranda just made, or were there different rationales being offered?
It's very similar. These have been a lot of the same folks who have been pushing for it over the years. So you have education leaders who are essentially saying, we're not servicing the students who are already here. The arguments are essentially saying, we don't want to penalize people who have otherwise demonstrated a connection to the state and an interest in participating in our education system and, key, workforce just because they happen to not be documented coming into it. So many of the same arguments were made. I believe people might hear a ring of Beacon Hill's favorite buzzword in the way that the conversation has been conducted. Do you want to guess at it?
I'm going to guess competitiveness.
It is competitiveness.
Awesome. Yeah.
So it's not just that the education leaders are saying that there's kind of a humane reason to be pushing for it, but this has also very much become a workforce issue.
You know, as you mentioned that, it reminds me of when the driver's license issue played out. I remember when that was passed, watching House Speaker Ron Mariano address the advocates who've been pushing for it, and he framed that, he praised them for reframing the arguments that they made for that, turning it into a public safety issue as opposed to a fairness issue. So it sounds like something similar might be
Really
going on
great
here.
comparison.
Am I remembering right that Jim Rooney from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce was at the panel that you covered, or am I getting that wrong?
He wasn't at the panel. I did talk to him afterward because the panel was focused on education leaders and immigration officials, and you have to know, well, some of them mentioned the workforce component to it, and Jim Rooney, of course, is the person you go to if you want to know how the business community feels about a workforce argument.
And he was positive, right?
He is. He basically said his initial concerns were if it was kind of just a blanket offer, he'd have some quibbles, but given the specific restrictions and given kind of the emphasis on keeping the people who are already here, he said this seems to make a lot of sense, and they are, of course, dealing with really serious workforce shortages across sectors.
I want to ask you both if there are arguments that are percolating that you're hearing that are being made against this proposal. Is there anything out there?
I haven't really heard anything, but I want to say two things based on what Jennifer said. We've been hearing a lot about competitiveness, and I've been shifting the conversation on Beacon Hill that it's more about belonging. These young people are already here. They're in our public school systems disproportionately. When we think about the workforce challenges, COVID-19 taught us something, and we can't go back to normal because normal wasn't good enough. So I haven't heard any, but there are some people that are pushing on the anti-immigrant movement that these laws are archaic, but that comes from the federal level. If we're going to compete and we're going to make sure people know that they belong in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Massachusetts is one of the top 15 states where there are underdocumented and undocumented families. And they're already here, they're working, going to school, playing, they're serving us, they're our teachers. And so we want to make sure if community colleges and in-state institutions are the place where hope and opportunity live, we want everyone in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to have the same hope and opportunity.
Jen, are you hearing any arguments being advanced against this, even quietly?
So I think one of the things that Senator Miranda points to correctly is that the objections to this are in line with kind of broader objections to the idea of incentivizing in some way people to be coming to the country because they will have opportunities to, in the driver's license situation, be able to drive and be, licensed even if they aren't documented. And in this case, most of the objections have focused again around the idea of encouraging people to come here, which, if that's your position, you feel is counter to the purposes of the immigration system.
Tell me if I've got this right. Michael Roderick, who you mentioned earlier, the Senate Ways and Means Chair, he headed off one possible argument against this, or at least made a move in that direction by saying when the Senate budget was rolled out that based on the projections he is seeing, this would actually be a money maker, right? Because enrollments, I think he argued, at state colleges and universities are declining, so this bring more people in who'd be paying into the system. Am I getting that right?
Yes, and one thing about students that go to state institutions, they likely stay here. I went to Wellesley. I come from a mixed status family. The month I walked onto the campus of Wellesley, my father was deported. And so I know a lot about family separation and this immigration argument. But when you have 1 in 6 people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who are foreign born, this is an economic opportunity and an equity and racial justice issue. And I am, really excited to work with the chairman and Senate President because they both have been very vocal in support of this, and I believe most of my colleagues will be too.
So this, as you mentioned right at the beginning of this comment, this has been kicking around for a while. I think
20 years.
Former Governor Romney vetoed a budget section that would have done something similar 20 years ago. The House voted against it also about 20 years ago. Senate President Spilka, before she was Senate President Spilka, came out in favor of this idea again almost 2 decades ago. How likely is it this becomes a reality this session, do you think?
It's very likely. Senator Crichton and myself are working incredibly hard, and when you have 2 important people in the Senate supporting this already, I think most of my colleagues, maybe not all, but most of the Democratic colleagues, I think will be in support of this because of the argument about the workforce challenges, about competitiveness. But for me, it's about equity and inclusion and the moral argument. And I think the combination of both make it a really successful amendment.
Jen, closing question for you. When the driver's license ballot question passed last year, it was about, I think, 8 percentage points, 54 to 46. Where do you think public opinion stands on this? And do you think, that's a terrible question to throw at you. Let me reframe it. Do you think that state lawmakers might be getting out ahead of public opinion when it comes to looking to carve out new benefits for some people who are undocumented?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball on hand.
Noted.
The thing that I would be pointing to is actually what the senator referenced is that this is a fairly popular policy nationwide. It might surprise people that Texas as a state loves it
surprised me.
so much that they actually agreed to let students out of state who are not Texas residents pay in-state tuition requirements because they wanted to keep their in-state tuition requirements for undocumented students. So this isn't something that tends to actually break really hard along policy
Yeah, that's
grounds.
fascinating.
So I expect this might be a similar situation in Massachusetts.
And when you have 23 states and the District of Columbia, we don't want to be behind. Massachusetts tends to be a leader, tends to be #1, and we're falling behind on this.
I feel like any time that advocates can point out, we like to think of ourselves as leading, but we're falling behind, there's real
And we're
political
behind
power in that.
Texas. I mean, I don't think anyone wants to be behind Texas.
Go
All right,
straight for the
Senator
pride.
Liz Miranda, Jennifer Smith of CommonWealth, thank you both for being here.
Of course.
Thank you.